So let's just get straight into today's question. How do we best answer the question, what is Vedanta? Specifically, when dealing with an open-minded person, well-versed in matters of self, approaches to enlightenment, the Vedic and Zen traditions, metaphorical meanings of religions, and meditation. Okay, so this is something that comes up a lot. How do you answer the question, what is Vedanta? Usually the answer to that question is depends who you're talking to. And so this questioner has exactly specified who we're talking to. Someone who is well-versed in matters of self, and self with a capital S, enlightenment, Zen traditions, metaphorical meanings of religions, and meditation. So one of the other ways to think about the answering of this question is to not have a single stock answer to this. I believe it's the Zen tradition that the idea of beginner's mind comes from. Beginner's mind means that you always start as if you were a beginner in the subject. So the idea can be applied here, which is that when someone asks you the question, you adopt beginner's mind, which means like, well, okay, now how would I define it? You're not returning to an answer that exists in your memory. You're reconfiguring your understanding sort of in the present moment for them. But the problem with that, of course, is that you may be inarticulate. So it's good to have a balance of both. So what you can do is, in your own mind and in your own time, just create a series of answers to that question, things that are true for you. Make them as long or as short as you want. But of course, remember that if the purpose of this is to answer the question to somebody else, less is more. And then let them ask. So you're creating your own series of answers. Now, as to what aspects you include, it's up to you. Okay, so here we've got what it is, its effects, and its practices, or its causes. So let's just go through this. When you're answering the question, what is Vedanta, if you wanted to say what it is, you could describe it as a set of philosophical principles or higher values. And their role is to describe the human experience. What do you do with that set of philosophical values? You apply subjective science, which is a method of inquiry to make the unknown known. And the field of inquiry is your own self, the subject of your experiences. And it's also a set of practices or disciplines that we put in place to achieve certain other effects, which are what? The effect of the study and the practice of Vedanta philosophy is, firstly, that we take things less personally. We make things less about us. Simple day-to-day example, a partner or a colleague or a co-worker criticizes you in some way with some frustration and anger. Now, we can take it personally and react badly to it, or we can be more objective and actually compassionate to the person speaking so that we can really receive what they're saying. Okay, which one's going to be better for your overall well-being and functioning? The second one. So we take things less personally. As you heard in that, you also become more giving, less selfish, or the other phrase we use is ego-centered, and the word ego has a specific definition here. We grow in our wisdom and make better choices, and we identify our true self, so-called non-dual awareness. So these are the effects. How do you get to those effects? What are the causes? First is becoming exposed to philosophical material. And, as the question was talking about, there's a lot written in the Vedic literature, the Zen literature, different religions, and so on and so forth. It comes in secular poetry. So it comes in a lot of different forms, epic poems that tell stories and so forth. So the first of these causes is exposing yourself to that and just reading or listening to it. The second of the practices or the causes is for the emotional side of the personality, and that's gratitude and wonderment. So that wonderment is when the intellect fails to recognize an unknown realm. How does nature know what to do next? You cut yourself and it immediately starts to heal. How does nature know? I don't know. There's a sense of wonderment. Why is there something instead of nothing? I don't know. The intellect fails. And so there's a feeling of wonderment that comes from that. The elevation of our emotions is the key element here. It's a expansion of yourself. It makes you receptive to more knowledge. So it opens the ears, if you like, and sort of opens the mind. And the third of the cause is unselfish action. So that's acting for the well-being of others. That expands your compassion, again, the emotional side, and it also helps to focus the intellect on a higher goal or a higher ideal. Finally, or not finally, sorry, also self-reflection and your own effort. So all of these practices will have very little effect if you're not doing this towards a developmental ideal. So for that, it requires self-reflection of your temperament, what sort of person you are generally, maybe some of your strengths, definitely your weaknesses, areas that you need to improve or your growth edges, and then integrating actions to work through those growth edges. So that's the self-reflection and the effort. And the last of the causes is dhyana. Now, the word dhyana is a Sanskrit word which translates as meditation. I've removed the word meditation here and kept the Sanskrit because the word meditation is defined in a very broad range of ways. So a lot of those definitions of meditation actually fit more into the self-reflection part. Dhyana has a specific meaning of converging the mind to a single point or to a single thought with nothing else. And then that finally itself snapping. So those are the causes to the effects that we're looking for. So back to the question. How do we best answer the question, what is Vedanta? Understand what it is for yourself. Be able to explain it to yourself. Verbally, do it out loud if you're in the car. What is Vedanta? Try to answer it for yourself. There's no one best answer, but you should have a pretty good understanding of a few different ways to approach it, so that when you do answer, you can speak with what you have a confidence you've thought about before, but also there's a sense in which it's spontaneous for you, so there's a degree of authenticity that comes through as well. Any questions related to that?
Yeah. It's almost like all of these things are developing in me. The points that have just been pointed out. Something happened today that was, nothing really bad. And what happened is I was filling up the gas tank of my car, and I wasn't watching. I prepaid, and I overfilled the tank. So the gas ended up on the floor of the gas station. So I just finished it up, and then I drove home, and then I looked it up, and it pointed out that something like that can ruin the system for the vapors, and it can very likely cause severe damage to that particular part of the system. It's very expensive to fix. It's like $1,000. So initially I was upset with myself for not being more careful or watching what I was doing. And I called my daughter up just to tell her and vent a little bit. Oh, what this terrible thing happened to me. And she said, ever heard of the second arrow? And I said, no. And it's a Zen saying, the first arrow is what happens when something unfavorable happens. You respond immediately without thinking, you get upset, you get maybe angry. But you got to watch the second arrow. The second arrow relates to when you react to that and you end up doing something harmful to yourself in response to something that already happened. And in my case, I was able to I didn't get angry after that. I realized, it's just something that happened. I don't care if it costs, whatever it costs, I'll get it fixed. Essentially, that's something that didn't happen before. I probably would have carried that with me for a while, but now it doesn't. The idea of your definition of what is spirituality is somehow diminishing your ego, diminishing your selfishness, your looking at yourself as something really important. So, oh, how can this happen to me? Kind of thing. So all of these things are resonating with me. And when I do talk to my friend, it very likely will come up. He is going through difficulties himself, and he ends up now living in a Zen center and given responsibilities that he's really not very happy about because of his circumstances. And so we automatically kind of default to these kinds of issues. How do we deal with this thing? And in the process, when I saw him the last week or 2 weeks ago, within the last 2 weeks, I realized just how similar Vedanta is to the principles of Zen Buddhism, which was interesting. He's not a newbie in all this. He's been practicing for the last 40, 50 years. So it's refreshing to be able to be on the same page with him and really very, very relaxed and have a wonderful time dealing with all of these things. And the reason I asked the question is it's probably going to come up. This, what has been on? What are you doing now, Roy? And I really appreciate your answering that, not just for the question that may or may not come up, most likely will, and being able to clarify it to this person, to this being, this me. So,
Yeah, so that's a good practice that you can do before the next meeting. That's something that's an active step you can take to sort of answer that question, which is to just, depending upon how you best do it, whether it's pen and paper or dictating into your phone or whatever it happens to be, is to have a practice at answering that question as succinctly as you can, put it into one paragraph, say, and write different versions of it that are all equally true, but just describe it in different ways.
yes, I will do that, definitely.
Yeah, and then you can sort of, again, if you prefer to be brief, you can sort of just pick the one that seems to resonate with you at the most at that time, and then speak from there.
Okay. Yeah, and if I may, there's another thing that happened last week, actually. My other daughter was in a little accident, and she actually technically lives with me because I have a little add-on, which is like a converted garage that she's living in. And so we're on the same insurance. And she had a little fender bender, and she was at fault. And she came up to me very casually and says, "Dad, would you sign this document that I got from the insurance company?" And I said, "Sure." So I looked at it and I said, "What is this about?" And she says, "Well, remember that accident? Well, the person I hit is suing me for $500,000. And the insurance company is taking it up as an excessive claim." And so I said, wow. And I immediately got a little upset because my name's on that account. So I could be, you know, on the giving end of that, whatever happens. So that did upset me. But there again, the next day I had let it go. And pretty much doesn't matter, whatever results from it. I don't think it's going to be a $500,000 debit to my account, but I'm not going to worry about it. Those are just the two kind of examples of how my ego can really get tied up in those kinds of things, because it affects this entity that is me, this self with a little s.
So it's important to remember that when you look at the non-dual perspective, it can be misrepresented by the ego and actually cause what's known as spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that anyone who's on the spiritual path is potentially subject to. Essentially, what happens is that we are affected by something that happens. You gave a couple of good examples. And our mind responds with maybe anger, frustration, fear, some form of agitation that is unpleasant to us. And rather than dealing with it directly and working through it, which is a way to sort of gain insight into it, there is a sort of an immediate disconnection from the experience. And that doesn't deal with the cause-effect relationship. It doesn't deal with the fact that I was triggered and I had this particular response. And so in a way, it's actually a suppression. So I bring that up only because this is how all of these ideas can be used, that we actually deny the emotional experience we are having rather than being able to live with it and include it in a larger whole. So that's where some of the principles and ideas can become ways of almost dissociating from your own mind rather than integrating it. Now, the fundamental idea is that consciousness is all pervasive. So when you try to separate yourself from negative emotions, then you're creating distinction rather than all pervasiveness. You're creating a boundary or a barrier between you and something else. And if it's done forcefully, then it becomes a sort of a suppression. So it's important to recognize where that might be happening, and that will be in places where there is a powerful response to something, like some sort of emotion. And also the other thing you can look for is how often it repeats in memory. So what do I mean by that? It could be that I say, that guy who stole from me, I've forgiven him. I'm beyond that now. But every time I talk to someone, I'm reminded of that event and I tell them about it. So if I've truly forgiven him, then it no longer continues to repeat or echo in the background of my ego's thoughts. Mm-hmm. So these are two things to look for. Did I have a strong emotional reaction to it? And has it come to a very quick conclusion, which maybe could indicate I've pushed it away? And secondly, does the thought or the memory of this thing continue to repeat in my mind? And if it does, then these are indications that it sort of needs to be understood a little bit more, which in turn can mean identifying with the experience through that lens of growth.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask the question, how do you include it in the whole? And I think you anticipated that with what you just said.
Yeah. The moment you put that lens of growth on, it now includes it in your experience. Okay, what am I experiencing? Why am I experiencing? What does it mean? What does it say about my beliefs? How true are they? What can I do to counter those beliefs?
Right.
So you've actually you brought it into the classroom, as it were, and said, okay, Mr. Anger, what messages have you got? And let's test them out. Let's see what they are. So you're including in the discussion rather than pushing it away. Same thing, gratitude practice can be used for the same sort of spiritual bypassing, rather than admitting a sense of perhaps failure or fear of not having enough or jealousy towards others. Rather than admitting that I have these, the moment I begin to feel them, I sort of push them away and say, no, I'm grateful for what I've got. I've got this, 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 and this. So I'm not really dealing with those emotions and the causes. I'm just putting a barrier of gratitude in front of it, if you like. So it's a way of pushing away, and it doesn't solve the problem. So that's the balance that needs to be struck.
Could you elaborate on the problem? It doesn't solve the problem.
The problem is the fact that I am experiencing these negative mental states with regards to a situation. So someone stole from me. Now, the ideal situation is to move on from it in a way that doesn't absorb my attention unnecessarily and impact the way for me to make good choices. But if it keeps nagging at me, if I'm always angry at this guy because he stole from me and afraid it's going to happen again, and I've lost my capacity to trust, and it keeps bugging me, it's then becoming something that does need to be dealt with. So that could be the problem. So that's what needs to be solved. And we may not solve the problem just by avoiding some of these effects of negative emotions using sort of, like I say, gratitude techniques or disconnection techniques that are sort of presented as being meditative.
And they're really just avoidance. It's, in other words, that is not an ideal response by...
Yeah, correct. So it is just avoidance. So it's not that the instruction itself is wrong. It's just that it's been applied wrongly, because the instruction for self-realization ultimately, as we covered in here, is dhyana, which is an actual, if you like, dissociation from matter in a sense, as a practice. But if you apply that wrongly, then you get, as I say, this continuous suppression of the self rather than integration.
How do you identify whether it's avoidance versus incorporating that into your awareness?
Have a look at the effects of that avoidance. So the first thing I'd do is ask yourself, if I was avoiding and suppressing in this way, what are the likely effects on my personality going to be? What am I likely to experience? And just give that some thought, and you'll probably come up with some fairly obvious answers. And they center around, another sort of set of negative thoughts and emotions. The other way to think about it is that it's a pattern, it's a holding pattern. So if there is a particular thought pattern or thought habit that has continued in an associated set of emotions and an associated behavior, if it has continued over time, it indicates that any work you're doing on it isn't getting you anywhere, or it hasn't really shifted it. So you could be in a holding pattern with regards to habits of thought, feeling, and behavior.
So in contrast to avoiding or suppressing, how best is it to deal with it in a healthy way, in a way which doesn't affect your subsequent dealings with life and things that come your way and arise for you?
Yeah, so that's where the self-reflection and the effort comes in. So the way to deal with the emotions, for example, is to self-reflect, which means that essentially you're having a, if you like, a two-person dialogue with yourself. the analogy of Christ speaking with the devil, or the analogy of a parent dealing with a child, the intellect speaking to the mind. You're sort of asking questions about your own temperament. So when you have an experience, you question that experience. What am I experiencing? Where did it come from? What are the triggers externally? What are the underlying causes? How is my ego at play here? What does growth look like? And how can I integrate growth-oriented actions into my day? In order to go through this process, you have to answer the questions of how you're feeling, not just with labels, but in a sense, you have to go to the emotions themselves. So you're actually you're remembering those experiences, not just as a title or a label for what they are, but as you subjectively had them. The danger, of course, here is that you get lost in all of that. But the point is that you have to know it in order to understand it. And you have to understand it in order to manage it. So you got to go to the knowing of it. What keeps you objective when you're going through that process is that you're always asking questions. You're seeking to understand. You're asking questions of whatever it is you are experiencing. And so you occupy a position back here, if you like, in a sense, witnessing it while you're experiencing it.
I find that I am weak in knowing whether it's an authentic experiencing it, or whether it's just a rationalization or a way of suppressing it, you might say.
Yeah, I wouldn't get too hung up on answering that question. What I would put more effort into is understanding the distinction of those two things, and then simply asking the question. And whatever answer you get, believe it. And it could be wrong, but keep asking, and eventually the right answer will come through and you'll see it as such. Don't be worried too much about getting right answers, wrong answers. It's not a school, it's not a test. Just understand the distinction between authentically applying it and suppressing or spiritual bypassing. Just be aware of the difference. And then simply ask the question to yourself, give it a little bit of thought, seems to me like, and then believe the answer and then act accordingly.
I need to really educate myself on the concept or the phenomena of spiritual bypassing. I would tend, I can't trust this, but it's easy for me to rationalize and say, well, I've understood it. It's okay. I know it's not the end of the world, and life goes on, and it's not worth whatever effect it is, whether it's $1 million or $1, or whether it's the loss of somebody or the gaining of somebody. This is what has arisen, and I accept it. It's this life, and it's affecting this self, and the self is really not of utmost importance.
So yeah, the way to test if it's been genuinely applied is the quality of your mental state after it. If the quality of your mental state after it, and I say after it, means in the immediate aftermath, if you like, of that kind of rationalization, and following, you pick a timeline, hours, a day, whatever, depending upon the sort of experience that you're managing. And if there's an alleviation of ego because you've as you said, liberated yourself from that egoistic response by recognizing, what is most important, the money or the person? The person. So who cares? Then you will feel those effects of a released ego. So you'll feel more giving, you'll feel more compassionate, you'll be more at peace mentally, less agitated emotions, and less harassed by thoughts. Again, that effect might last for a relatively shorter or longer period of time as the thought pattern continues to reassert itself. But generally, that would be the way to test to see if you've been effectively managing it, is that there's a greater sense of peace and openness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's, I hesitate to say it because it just could be more ego, more ego. But I find that I am more giving and more forgiving and more accepting. And I guess all I can do is continue to ask the questions and apply the fundamentals and see what and very carefully observe what happens. Be aware of what's going on with me.
Yeah, so the key is, again, the effect is that we make things less about us, or we take things less personally, but we make things less about ourselves. Mm-hmm. So we're pushing ourselves unnecessarily into circumstances, or bringing our perspective into it without any real conscious decision or need to do so. As you to gain the effects of these practices, you find that you assert yourself less and less until or unless you need to. Then you assert yourself as forcefully as you need to, but it's not being done when it's not necessary. So anytime we assert or take more than we need, it's the ego functioning.
Yeah. Well, I've got a lot of work to do. It's, I think, a matter of really being vigilant every moment. For me, that's what it is at this point in my life. Just got to really be as alert as I can be, because what prevents me from going forward is patterns of the past, patterns of how I've had responded to things in my life all those years. And then now I'm realizing how that those things are no longer, but the patterns still remain.
Yeah, so the awareness is not the whole story. The awareness isn't the only part is required here. And this, again, is some of the limitation of the meditative techniques that are provided. It's one of the reasons that I think mindfulness needs to be looked at a couple of times before you think about taking it up, because the practice as it's presented today has been divorced from an ethical framework or a moral framework, which the whole Zen tradition or the Buddhist religion carried with it. So the mindfulness practice was never, I believe, meant to be divorced from the whole ethical framework. And yet the way it's presented today is just a practice you do, mindfulness-based stress reduction. The implication is that you get relief from the stress, but the implication is not necessarily that you eradicate the cause of stress. And that's done through, as to sort of springboard off what you're talking about, recognizing what the underlying thought patterns are, assessing their worth, and then putting effort in to shift your thought patterns or upgrade your operating system. So that kind of, what's the word, effort, and in a sense it's humility to be able to face your weaknesses, is something that is less appealing than simply sitting and observing, being aware of what's going on. So awareness can go some way towards that, because your own natural wisdom sometimes just comes to the fore in awareness. But in general, it's not enough. There needs to be the effort as well, the effort in upgrading those thought patterns, not simply maintaining awareness of their effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of heavy lifting.
Well, again, it's look at the source of the heaviness. The implication there is that there's an external weight that has to be picked up. Well, what's the cause of the excess weight? And if you work there, you can make the lifting less heavy. The other thing to remember is that you, in a sense, can choose to focus in a way that you're picking up less. What that means is that you set your goals close enough to you that they are achievable with effort that you know you have. So it's an example of this. Someone wants to reduce their sugar intake. To take a really pedestrian example, they're currently addicted to sugar. So going from that to zero is too much. It's a lot of heavy lifting, as it were. So you make a choice for a behavior that you feel you can accomplish with what effort you have. So the person might say, well, I'm not going to have sugar after 9 p.m. Okay, they're normally in bed by 10:30. They can easily say the last hour and a half, no sugar. It's a step in the direction of giving up sugar. And it's one that is achievable within their resources. So how much have they chosen to lift up? No sugar after 9 p.m. It's a behavior. So when it comes to dealing with those challenges that come through in life, the idea is to put it into a behavior that you want to embody, and you describe that behavior as easily or as difficult as you wish, so that you feel you're doing some lifting, because you do have to feel you're putting an effort, but not that it's an overbearing lift. So to an extent, we have some control there.
One of the patterns I have is that I tend to go to extremes. And so doing it more in line with what I can more easily do is hard for me. But I can see it, and therefore I can go in that.
So have those goals been at least set, or are they not at all set? Those ones that are closer and more in line.
I didn't quite understand the question.
So you said the difficulty is in staying with goals that are within my resources. Is that right?
Yeah.
So does it mean that the goals themselves are beyond your resources?
I don't know.
Yeah, so that's part of the where you need to continue to focus then. If you don't know what that is, that area you need to continue to investigate.
Okay. Yes, that's right.
And then when that gets clearer, the whole practice becomes easier.
Yeah. It's getting easier.
Yeah,
it is.
It does. It does get easier.
Yeah, it's getting more realizable, and yeah, and it's coming about, and for which I am very well. like to say I. What's happening little by little. I think, well, I know all of this discussion is very helpful to me. And I certainly, I'm recording this actually, and I will listen to it again.
Yeah, good.
I must
Yeah.
do that.
It's also on YouTube there. Yeah, it streams up. A lot of these Q&As are up there. VT as well.
Will this be on there?
Yes, this will be.
And when will it be on?
As soon as YouTube has finished processing it, so however long that takes.
Okay. And that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Much appreciated.
Hmm. So if there's any other questions.
No.
All right. Well, if not, thanks for coming with a question. It's always great to have a starting point.
Thank you very much.
Most welcome. Have a good day, mate, and I'll catch you next time.
Yes.